Hi everybody, welcome to the LSE, welcome to our physical audience, and welcome also to our online audience who are 150 plus people. If you want to tweet about tonight, it's hashtag LSETII or hashtag LSE events. I'm Grace Lordan, I'm the Director of the Inclusion Initiative here at the LSE, and it really is my honour and privilege to welcome Gavin Lewis, who is a Managing Director at BlackRock, has previously held positions in Vanguard, UBS Management and Russell Investments. Tonight we're here to talk about his book, The Opportunity Index, which I really enjoyed reading, so I'm looking forward to hearing your comments about that also. Alongside being an author and being a professional, Gavin is a trustee of the Old Theatre Trust, the NFL UK Foundation and the Pensions Policy Institute. So how we're going to work tonight is we're going to hear from Gavin for 15-20 minutes. He's going to give us a lecture, then we're going to sit down and have a Q&A. My colleague, Jasmine Vera, is there to take questions from the online audience. So if you're online, please do text questions live. And we'll also look forward to having a conversation with the audience. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Gavin Lewis to the LSE this evening.
Hi, everyone. How are we doing? Good. I have to admit, my first reaction when I walked in was that, oh, there are actually people here. Not to be self-depreciating in any way. But I have to say thank you very much for attending, and it's good to see so many of you here physically and also online. And also, hello to some very familiar faces. It's very nice to have friends here, just dotted around in the audience. So thank you very much for the support. So I will maybe just give maybe 15-20 minutes or so just on why I wrote the book, the process of writing the book, and some of the key messages. I would start by saying that I am a asset management executive by day, so I don't do this as my full-time job, but I did feel compelled to find some way of broaching what is and can be a very difficult subject. I spent a long time trying to increase the representation of black and brown professionals in my industry, which is the asset management industry. And I think I started this in 2017, 2018. So this was when George Floyd, when it wasn't a safe discussion to have, assuming that it is now a safe discussion to have. And I was one of the early members of an initiative in the asset management industry called the Diversity Project, which some of you may or may not have heard about. And the initial brief that I was given, and it wasn't just me, there was some very inspirational people who came on this journey with me. But the original brief that we were given was to lead what was then called the ethnicity workstream. And then we were told to utilize the acronym BAME, so Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. So that's how long ago this was. And I and my peers, I guess, took an instant dislike to the term because it was a very all-encompassing term that really hid what is a non-homogeneous group and tried to make it homogeneous. So black, as we know, the diaspora could be black Caribbean, it could be West African, it could also be mixed, as my children are. Asian, as we know, is again an all-encompassing term. It could be South Asian or Southeast Asian. Could also be Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. So we deconstructed the term and came out and discussed the issues facing the black community, which was a risk because I was employed by a financial services organization. This was an uncomfortable conversation for them, as it was for me to a degree, because it felt like I was going out on a limb trying to address this topic. And we spent, 4 or 5 years trying to change the complexion of the asset management industry, which is probably quite typical of most financial services entities, which was very white, very male, though I have to say that the gender parity isn't quite there, but it's definitely improving. But certainly then, the only issue that one talked about was gender. So we tried to change the representation in the industry, and we would do talks like this to sometimes hundreds and thousands of people. We launched school programs, we launched mentoring programs, we launched sponsorship programs, and it felt like at some point we were making a difference. Then the pandemic happened, and obviously we know that was a very challenging period for many, many people, particularly socioeconomically deprived and disadvantaged communities. And then George Floyd happened. And that was really, really difficult. And it was difficult for a number of reasons, which, and I think Grace and I are going to have a discussion about that. But one of the reasons why it was difficult is because we had done so much, and yet this was still happening. We were also very, very tired, and we were burnt out from being a group of probably about 7 or 8 people who were trying to change the complexion of the industry. So it was what we felt, you know, the straw that broke the camel's back. And at that point, behind the scenes, we opted out, and we said that if we can't change anything and this still happens, then we're not going to do anything. What we did have, and we launched this movement called Talk About Black, what we did have was a profile, but also what we felt a responsibility to do something. So although we were hurt from what had happened, like deeply hurt, we also realized that in terms of making change, we were some of the most senior people in the industry that we worked at. And bearing in mind, like we were in our late 30s, early 40s, so like really not that senior, but senior enough that people looked to us and wanted us to make a difference. So we launched a campaign, and I'll talk about that campaign a little bit later. But I was also approached at the same time to write a book. And I felt that if I was going to write a book, that I would take a slightly different course. And that course would be based on my experience as a business exec. I'm not a HR professional. I'm not a DE&I professional. What I am is really, really good at my job. I'm a senior exec. I happen to be black. And I was going to utilize that platform to try to unravel what I felt was a discussion which had stalled and stopped and started. So I felt that in this discussion about race and ethnicity, disadvantage, that most of the discussion is about the social issues. So we use this term, socioeconomic disadvantage. But what we really talk about are the social interactions. What we rarely talk about are the economic interactions. So it might be the way that an individual looks at you, the way an individual interacts with you. It might be the bias that a teacher has in the classroom. It might be the bias that is, or racism, let's be honest, that is present in the police force. It might be the way that the health care professions treat black women and why they are more likely to die during childbirth. We tend to think about, although we tend to think about those issues and assume that actually those are social challenges. And I do think that's part of the equation. But the whole term socioeconomic disadvantage also has 2 other terms on it. It has the term economic in it, and it also has the term disadvantage in it. Disadvantage really is about poor life outcomes. And poor life outcomes are why we are more likely to suffer from greater rates of unemployment, be paid less, have greater the impact of mental health, why we're likely to be prejudiced in the classroom, and these are life outcomes, and that's what we should really be talking about. But the economic elements of that, i.e. why are we suffering from those poor life outcomes, was rarely discussed. So I thought that if I'm going to write a book, I'm going to explore that angle, and that's what I did. Now, I didn't mean to, for anyone that has read the book, I didn't mean to start with the transatlantic slave trade, because that is an incredibly heavy subject and is what this discussion always starts with. But again, without, spoiler alert, if you've read the first chapter, it's called Onion, because when I start to peel back the layers of the issue, it all led back to this this moment or this time or this period in history. Now, I work in the city, and I was at pains to try to understand why is it that we don't have the representation that we need. So I actually started with looking at the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. And I think when we think about Martin Luther King, we always think about the I Have a Dream speech. We always think about the Million Man March. But actually, Martin Luther King was an avid author as well. He was an author much more so than he was an orator. So I read his books. And in one of his books, one of his many books, which is called Where Do We Go From Here, which was published in just before his death in 1967, he said that although we can have social rights, we'll never have, as a black community, we'll never have equal rights until we have economic rights. And the civil rights movement was the start of it. So this is what the civil rights movement did, and if you think about what happened in the 1960s in the US and in the UK, there were a raft of civil rights acts passed both here and across the Atlantic. And they did allow black communities and others as well, so those with protected characteristics, to actually to stand a chance when it came to gainful employment and gainful pay. And the civil rights movement was very, very important, but that should have been seen as the first step. What we haven't had is the Economic Rights Act. What we haven't had is the economic rights movement. And I do feel that that is one of the impediments as to why we are still facing the challenges that we are today. So when I first started writing the book, I had to go therefore back past Martin Luther King, look through the Jim Crow laws and establish, well, actually, why did we get to the point that we are? So this is the Royal Exchange, not to be mistaken for the Bank of England, as many, many people do. And again, spoiler alert, if you've read the book, you know what I'm about to say. But when I first tried to get a job in the city, I walked past this probably about 4 or 5 times, and again, if you read the book, you'll know, because I got lost and I walked backwards and forwards, not knowing actually what I was walking past and not also knowing what it represented. But the reality is that I am here, so I am of Jamaican parentage, so Caribbean parentage. One of my aunts traced our genealogy, and I think my family lineage is something like 60 or 70% Ghanaian, which basically means that at some point, my family were put on slave ships and transported across the Atlantic in the triangle slave trade to Jamaica. And the transatlantic slave trade was a huge catalyst for the industrialization of the UK and the US. And actually, when you walk through the City of London, which I now work in, it's littered with reminders of this period. And this is the Royal Exchange, and it's still there now. And if you can see, and I'll do a close-up in a second, the plinth right at the top. So I'm not pointing to you, you can come in. It's purely coincidence. The plinth at the top has a figure in the middle, which is the figure of commerce. And in one hand, the figure of commerce has a book, and in the other hand, the figure of commerce has a rudder. And next to the figure of commerce, there are 12 different figures, each representing a different region or jurisdiction engaged in trade. So next to them, you have a Turkish merchant, a Chinese businessman, basically representing the UK's economic hegemony. But there's one figure that is dressed in rags and kneeling, and that represents an African slave kneeling at the feet of commerce. And that portrayal is exactly the extraction of wealth that happened of black communities and their contribution to economic wealth. What I found bizarre is when I was walking around the city that although this is there, so there is a link between the African slave, my family, my Jamaican parents, and the fact that I now work in the city, why are there so few? And why is it, again, spoiler alert, that I put in the book, that why is it that I feel that disadvantaged communities are still kneeling? This is very, very topical, and it's by pure coincidence that a story broke about Stephen Lawrence again today. What it also made me do when I was writing the book is try to think about, well, actually, what's my relationship with my white peers, and what's my relationship with the UK as a black person? So when I went to school, I originally went to school in Tottenham, and growing up in Tottenham, for me, was very, very difficult. I have to have a disclaimer here. It doesn't mean that everyone who grew up in Tottenham has had a difficult time. And also, again, disclaimer, I do not speak for everyone who ever grew up in Tottenham. So if there's anyone listening from Tottenham, I'm not talking about your experience, I'm talking about mine. Well, my experience was really, really difficult, and I had to contend with many of the things that young black males had to and still have to contend with. And that would be fighting, be it with my fists or with knives. I know of people who've been shot. I had numerous run-ins with the police. And my mum was really, really worried. One of the great things about the book is that it allowed me to actually build a very, very different relationship with my mum. And I know she's not listening because she really finds it hard to listen to me talking about these things. She sat through it once, and she's never going to sit through it again. But I don't think she'd mind me saying that when she was trying to raise myself and my sister, she would lie awake at night and worry about me either ended up in prison or getting stabbed or getting shot or worse. Now, I never knew my father, so he left us when we were really young. My mum was a member of the Windrush generation. Happy 75th year anniversary to obviously with the Windrush generation. And she thought that if I stayed in school in Tottenham, that I would end up in a bad place. So she sent me out of school to a school in Enfield. Now the school in Enfield was the schools in Enfield were very, very different. It was quite chaotic, the school that I went to in Tottenham, whereas Enfield was really, really calm. One of the other reasons why she sent me was because at school I was profiled and the teachers thought that I had learning difficulties. So there was a trend in the 1970s and 1980s with young Caribbean boys and girls who, for a number of reasons, and perhaps mine is as an example, for a number of reasons, were not performing to their potential in education. And they were classed as what was called ESN, so educationally subnormal. And they were systematically put in what was called ESN schools or special units, where they were treated as having learning difficulties. And I was on the brink of being put in one of these schools. And my mum, who is the real hero of the story, if you've read it, she felt differently, and she took me out of the school in Tottenham and put me in a school in Enfield. And that, I think there were moments in life where you think about what were the pivotal things that really changed and defined you, and that was absolutely one of them. So I owe my mum a huge amount. But what she didn't know is that the school that I went to in Enfield was a stronghold for the National Front. So they were called NFs, then they became the BNP, they're now called the English Defence League. They'll be called something else, I assume, at some point. And I ended up in this very bizarre situation where I was travelling from Tottenham and dealing with the challenges that young black males, some faced in Tottenham, having a few moments of peace and then arriving in Enfield and having a different type of challenge. And it was just as violent, but just not with other black people, but with white people. And it was really, really tough for us. And I was 15 when Stephen Lawrence got murdered. And I remember it vividly because we were worried about the same thing happening to us. So it wasn't just something that we read in the paper, it was real. And we remember quite vividly that these were also poor kids, but they just happened to be white. They also had no fathers. but there was something going on in the demographic that made us the enemy, and I think it's something that Grace and I will probably talk about in the discussion afterwards. But what it did, now reflecting on that period, what it also did is also define racism in the UK, because the Daily Mail of all newspapers came out and actually named some of the perpetrators. And this is a very conservative and right-wing newspaper. But what it did as well is it made the society in the UK define racism as something which was violent and aggressive and that will kill people. The impact of that, however, is that there is a different type of racism. There's a different type of prejudice, which we don't talk about, and that is the type that is non-violent, that is a type that is a lot more insidious, and that's the bit that I feel that we have never spoken about, and that is a lot of the things that we're still wrestling with today, and it's actually inside our institutions and inside attitudes, still hidden, and it is something that I think we need to contend with. So whilst I was writing the book, we also launched a campaign. Some of you, if you work in finance, probably most definitely, but if you don't, some of you may recall during that period on LinkedIn, there was a campaign which went viral, which had a number of people holding up signs saying, "I am." And you know something's truly gone viral when you hear people talking about it and saying, who on earth started this annoying campaign? And they're saying it to you, not knowing that you started it. So this campaign was started by myself and two of my closest friends in the industry. And it was a response to George Floyd, and it was the only thing that we felt we could do to help galvanize people and get them thinking about what a solution is. And I think it was amazing. It was incredibly moving, and it still pop up on my LinkedIn feed now. My only regret, however, is that in my original post, I posed a number of questions, and those questions are some of the things that I alluded to about life outcomes. So I posed a number of questions which said, why is it that as a black male I'm more likely to die prematurely, suffer from poor mental health, be paid less, be unemployed longer, have poor educational outcomes? And my only regret is that that original post got lost in people holding up I ams. I also think about this, this period as well, and I do wonder what many of the people who held up those signs, like what are they doing now? Because I think one of my concerns is that this issue was very, very 2020. And we seem to lurch from one crisis to another. But some people, they are in perma-crisis. So of course I put up the picture about Stephen Lawrence. I could have put the picture of George Floyd up. I could have put a picture of Rodney King up. I could have put a picture of Emmett Till up. So when I was speaking to this period to my mum, she said she went through the same thing in the 1960s with Emmett Till. I remember the period when Stephen Lawrence was murdered. We've gone through it with George Floyd. How do we actually create lasting change, or do we have to wait for another tragedy to happen again before we actually get to grips with this issue? And the book really is an attempt to deconstruct that problem and also try to come up with a solution. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Gavin, for that amazing start. When you were talking, I was reminded in the book, so firstly, Gavin will be signing books afterwards. So if you haven't read the Opportunity Index, please do stay and buy the book. When I read the book, I was struck about the different forms of racism that you experienced as a younger boy. So you talk about interactions with white peers when you moved to Enfield. And then you talked about your teacher, which you spoke about, who accused you of being cognitively impaired. But what actually became before that was an altercation with her where she was clearly in the wrong. So she grabs you, and that's clearly not right for a teacher to do in that particular circumstances. And it felt like a distraction to me in the way that I heard the story. So I'm wondering, you've gone back and you've unpacked this. So I'm wondering how these experiences have shaped who you are today.
Thank you, Grace. So Again, I think one of the things I talk about in the book is, so there's quite a lot here, so is the impact of trauma. So many people say, yeah, it was difficult, Gavin, but look, I mean, you've got this amazing job, you've got this beautiful family, and you live in the life of London, and that is all true. But my retort to that is normally, yeah, but at what cost? Like, at what cost did you have to bear the scars to get to that point? Because it shouldn't have been as difficult as it was. So one of the outcomes that I'm very much aware of is, like, I've suffered trauma. And that is not good for you. It's not good for you emotionally, it's not good for you physically. So again, in one of the chapters, Almonds, I spend quite a long time discussing the challenges that I've had with mental health and dealing with that trauma. However, there is also there's a reason why I guess, relatively speaking, I've achieved a lot. And when I say achieved a lot, I mean relative to where I started and expectations. And it's kind of one of the premises behind the book, Grace, that when you do face adversity, it does equip you with a huge array of attributes. And now, I don't think that one should suffer trauma to achieve those attributes. So with my own children, who have a very, very different life to me, I think about how do I get them to get that same attributes that I have, but without suffering the trauma. But I do also think that it's equipped me and many other people who've suffered similar things, or experienced, I should say, similar things, with a huge array of attributes that they can call on when needed. I do also, however, realise that it's probably changed my relationship with, if I'm honest, with institutions. So, because I think when you, particularly at that age, there's a lot of trust between the school, parent, and the child. And of course you don't really realise it at the time, but you know something's not quite right. But if that's your experience with institutions who are meant to be there and have your best interests at heart, then one, I feel, develops a mistrust of those institutions. And it isn't just the classroom. As I alluded to before, it could be healthcare profession, it could be the judicial system, it could be the political world, or even the corporate world. And I do think I need to be very, very aware of how I view institutions generally, because of the experience that I've had, and have to work quite hard not to always assume that they haven't got my best interests at heart. And that is quite difficult, I have to say.
One thing that you mentioned briefly when you were speaking was about the resistance to black people in the UK, about moving through the social hierarchy. And you talk about it can be quite subtle, so not necessarily something that's very, very overt, and sometimes, it's quite hard to prove. And I'm wondering what you would like to see firms do, so in financial services, which I know you work and you've been really successful, and also the government. So what can the government do to kind of tackle these very, very subtle things that are actually holding really talented people back, so we get closer to the meritocracy?
Yeah, and I think this is almost the crux of the issue, which is like, how do you actually change like the experience that people have on a day-to-day basis? Because I think you can put the right policies in place, or not the right policies. You can put policies in place. You can put the right HR or DE&I actions in place. But a lot of it comes down to a number of things outside of those quite process-driven initiatives. So it might be, for example, the culture of an organisation, the culture of a society, and also how individuals themselves relate to the issue. Because effectively what you're trying to do is change people's perception of themselves and change people's perceptions of one another. And it's very hard to go into each and every, the 60-odd million people that we have in the UK, go into their heads and twist something and make them see different. It's very, very difficult to do. And I know this is, the big question, my solution to this was, well, actually, what does make people change and act differently. Because, like, I think when we have this discussion, we often end up speaking to ourselves. So we have echo chambers where I can have this talk and I can have a bunch of friendly people in the room, but it's actually the people outside who wouldn't engage with that we need to change. And actually the question is, how do you get those people to change? Because you are all experienced it, all are allies, and you're probably like 10%. It's the other, there are those who probably, and again, this is written in the book, but there's a 10% that will actively, or maybe it's a bigger number, that will actively act against this. But there's this big swathe in the middle who are quite apathetic and probably would engage with it if it would be made easy for them, or if it's at the top of their agenda. So the question is, how do you actually move that middle? So I think either company or government policy needs to establish that fact and then act accordingly. On the company side, just to give you one example, and it's probably the best example that I've seen, because I think we too often get into this discussion based on values and beliefs, i.e. I believe this is important and I value this, so therefore I'm going to do something about it. But it's actually not how most organisations operate. They operate on what you would hope, rational economic sense and what impacts the balance sheet. But I had a chat with a CEO of a company that, I won't name the company, I don't know how public they want this to be, but they used to sell goods via magazines, by trade press, and then obviously that's now defunct and redundant, and now they do it all online. And the problem that they've got is that because they're doing a lot online, they need like techies and data scientists to help them, but their profit margins are nowhere near the industry that I work in, which is finance. So they were really struggling to attract candidates, and the fact they couldn't actually find anyone became a risk to them. So what they did is they went to socio-economically deprived areas and offered a bunch of kids apprenticeships, and they trained them up to be data scientists. And they are now, maybe not, and I'm not saying this is the answer, maybe not in terms of ethnicity, but absolutely in terms of social mobility, they're now a very, very diverse organisation. But they did it because it impacted their bottom line. And that, I feel, stops it from going in and out of favour, because it is an economic decision that makes rational economic sense to that organisation. I would love them to do it because they care. I just don't think that's how most people or businesses operate.
But do you think, Gavin, that people get it? So one of my colleagues, Erica Brodnock, led some work looking at black professional women. And one of the things that was really striking about that is that black professional women reported that when they went into organisations, they either had to conform, go quiet, or they would leave. So they would leave to entrepreneurship or something that was quite different. And when I read that and I reflect on it, I think if the people in the room really got that having a black professional woman with a diverse perspective was good for business, they would include her in the conversation. And it feels that some of the battle is ego, actually, of the people who are the gatekeepers, who really might want to have a diverse picture, but they're not necessarily interested in having diverse perspectives around the table. Yeah,
and I've read Erica's work, and it's research-based, and it's very, very, you can't deny the experience that black women in the corporate world have had and are having. So a few things. Firstly, that's why representation matters, because there's no point in just hiring one of a demographic, because the company culture and ethos will be shaped by the majority. And often company cultures are like defined by that majority. Therefore, if you're the minority, that you have to fit into it, which is, so representation of course important in and of itself, but you need a groundswell of individuals to actually go there and start amending the culture. Secondly, yes, I think that it's, if you really valued, I agree with you, Grace, if you really valued the attributes that that person has, and you actually understood the unique attributes that person would bring, then you'd go out of your way to tap into it. And that alone would make one feel more included and will create a much more inclusive culture. And I think and this is one of the concerns that we do have, which is that this discussion around, in the workplace at least, which is more about diversity, equity and inclusion, there is a concern that the momentum behind it has slowed, and that many firms and corporations have put policies in place and often feel that that's it, that's enough, but it's not. That's the start, and you really therefore have to work on that inclusion piece. The challenge is how do you create more, because you can't tell people to be more inclusive. So you get back to that middle, and how do you actually get them to move and think, well, actually, if this person, and the McKinsey report, which is what everybody quotes, it's not enough, the business case has failed, because otherwise everyone would have a black person or a woman on their board, because they would add 28% or 36% to the bottom line. So we need to restate what that business case is.
Yeah. It's interesting. So when Norway did quotas on women, there was loads of companies delisted rather than put women on their boards, which I think really, again, speaks to, we say that diversity is good for business. You and I know diversity is good for business, but there's people who are gatekeepers who aren't necessarily making the changes. One thing that was super interesting in your book is that you state that we need to be realistic and recognise that those from disadvantaged communities, and particularly people from black communities who are low income, have to work harder to achieve the same results as those from advantaged backgrounds. And definitely reading your story, we can see that to be true. But I'm wondering, have you noticed any improvements over time? So we don't want to deny that the journey is harder, but have things gotten easier for people who are, 12 years and younger here in Britain?
Yeah, I mean, it depends which part of the community you speak to. So I think on the access to the corporate world, I think that has gotten better. So just the impact of social media, things like LinkedIn, having more visible role models. There are many more schemes now and initiatives available to younger people that want to get into the industry. So I certainly know that in my industry, there are some amazing charitable organisations, and I could write you a list, that are doing something and are giving access. So I think that aspect has improved. And actually, again, in the book, I talk about access as being one of the main economic impediments, and actually we need to create greater access to deconstruct barriers. But at the same time, inequality has increased, and actually access to education has become more difficult, because when I went to university, I got a grant, which is that the government gave you a few £1,000s. Now, I didn't move out because I still would have needed to take a loan, but I got money that really helped me, as well as working in a very well-known supermarket. It enabled me to get to university. I did a talk to a bunch of school kids. I've done talks to many, many school kids, but there was a particular group. I remember they were from Brent, and we did this talk at Wembley, and the questions they kept asking me were, do I have to go to university to get into finance? Or are there other ways in other than going to university? And I couldn't get my head around it. I was looking at these kids were so bright. Why would you not want to go to university? And so I asked one of the school teachers, and he said, it's because they're scared of getting into debt. Because if you come from a family which is struggling to pay the bills, which many of them were, the prospect of leaving university with £30,000 of debt is really, really scary. So although the access might improve, the economic barriers have increased. I also do, just one final point, it comes in and out of the newspapers, but these young kids are still dying. Right? The life crime statistics are still incredibly scary. We just don't, unless you have access to that community, you would never hear about it. So how is that progress?
And I think kind of staying with violence, one of the things that really stood out for me in the book was the impact that the murder of George Floyd had on you personally. And you actually speak about an experience of being held by the neck against shutters of a corner shop by a police officer. And you also speak about this interaction between Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper on the same day, where this woman called 911 and complained about Christian for attacking her and her dog, when clearly he was doing absolutely nothing of the sort. So he was there filming. So I can see people nodding, so I assume you know about that. But you also state that these two incidents show you the two sides of racism. So can you explain what you mean by this, that they show very distinctly the two sides of racism?
Yeah, so again, it's somewhat similar to the comments I made about the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which is that I think we assume that racism is aggressive, very physical and overt, and sometimes it can be. And I went to a school where I was called the N-word, or would see it painted on the side of a wall, and it does a huge amount of damage. Seeing, as I said, I haven't watched I can't get through the George Floyd video. It's not something that I would necessarily have gone back and try and watch, but I couldn't get through it. It was being sent to me by loads of people, and I couldn't get through it. There are a bunch of other videos that are similar. There was another one in the US about a very looked like a gentle giant, like trying to buy a cigarette, and I couldn't get through that one. So there were many of these videos. That I think had a quite a physical impact on me, because it did take me back to one of the many times when I would come home and I would never tell my mum that I'd been in the back of a police van and had been, accosted by the police because she'd never let me out of the house again. But it happened, and it happened regularly, and it was really, really scary. And that was quite a physical thing for me. The emotional impact of Christian Cooper in the park was, you can't prove, that happens, but how do you prove it? Because you know that is happening, but you can't quite articulate it. And I remember saying to my wife, and that was really, really upsetting as George Floyd was, because I'd had that experience where I felt that I was being treated poorly because of my race. I tried to fight it, and I couldn't prove it, and I knew I was being gaslit, and that caused an equally, and both on the same day, caused an equally emotional reaction. And that is the other side of racism. So we assume that it is something which you can put your hands on and you can touch. Often it's not, and sometimes it's just the feeling that you get when you walk into a room and you're not quite sure if you are welcome, or when you're applying for that job and you didn't get it, and why didn't you get it? And there's I again feel very strongly that we need to tackle both of those.
And again, if you haven't read the book, please do read it. I think you're extraordinarily open about your experiences of racism, and also speaking about Britain and the problems that we still have with racism today. And I think what's really fantastic is that you lay out these kind of 6 crucial aspects that we should follow in order to tackle racial inequality in the UK. So before we go to Q&A, can you run people through what those six things are?
Yeah, one thing I did learn about writing a book is that what most people do is they get a researcher to get all the historical facts for them. I was naive. I didn't. I just did it all myself. But the good thing about it is I actually do know the detail, rather than having to look it all up and think, what did my researcher do? So those 6 things. So this is the last chapter, and for me, I think the first thing one needs to do is quantify inequality, because there isn't a real measure for it. The closest that we have, and I was at a conference last week, and someone said, what about the Gini coefficient, which I did. I think they're trying to catch me out. I did say to them, it's in my book, I do talk about the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality between the poorest and the richest. But what it doesn't do is give you any detail actually what's behind it. So I think you need to quantify it in a very, very different way. Actually, what does income look like against different cohorts, and what are the inputs into that income differential? I'm totally aware that I work in the private sector, but policy and government has a role to play. I do think that that coalition between the public and the private sector can make a huge difference. It shouldn't just be left to the state, but it shouldn't also just be left to private corporations to fix this. Society needs to take responsibility for this. So the best analogy that I could think of is the issue of sustainability and the decisions that we make, whether you are a member of, whether you're a climate activist or whether you just think it's important or you don't, whether we like it or not, we all recycle without thinking about it. Pretty soon we'll all be driving electric cars. We never use plastic bags anymore, and again, if you've read the book, I won't spoil it, but that chapter is making an appeal to say, we do this for, there's many, many issues for which we do that. Actually, how are you going to do it? What's your plastic bag? We need to create a framework to actually measure this, and also understand the intersection between disadvantage, inequality, and equity, because they are related, but they are different, and I do sometimes think we get lost between the three terms. So yeah.
I will say, Gavin, I was quite disappointed tonight that your mother wasn't here. So if she does listen to the recording, it really comes through in the book how much she meant to you and how part of the journey. And given how well researched your book is, I know you'll be getting an honorary doctorate someday. So I do hope she comes to that talk. I really, really do. But with that, let's go to Q&A. So I've been told to take 3 from the room and then 3 online. So if we go to the room first, any questions for Gavin? So I have a question here, a question here, and a question from the gentleman at the side. Amazing.
I've got 2 on my
Very short, yeah.
I used to work on the financial institutions, and I'm just wondering what your perception is. We had black interns come and do projects with us. I found it really uncomfortable saying, oh, have you met the black intern? I just was so uncomfortable with it. So we had quite a discussion about how to phrase that. So just wondering what your theory is about that. And the other thing with your firm that you work for at the moment, which is listed as BlackRock, I know you have to be very positive about it, but how have they adapted to your language? Because I'm sure BlackRock's not perfect, but you can't say they didn't deal with it well, but just what your perceptions are about that.
Okay, so on the 10,000 Black interns, so I know the founders of 10,000 Black interns, they're good friends, the 3 of them, and I think they've done something pretty remarkable. The question to you, before I answer that, however, is, what made you uncomfortable? What was it? Was it the concept of itself, or was it just the interaction with the kids?
No, nothing to do with the interaction. It's more like saying, hello, my disabled friends, do this.
I understand.
And I'm disabled,
I understand. Okay. So I think the reality is that if you're going to move a disadvantaged group into and try to reduce their disadvantage, you have to call them out and treat them as an entity. And I say that, and that is not because they are, again, a homogenous group, because a black intern could be a number of things. But I think the term, and we used it when we coined the term "talk about black," it was a deliberate ploy, from what I understand, to say black interns because they are black. And unlike some other characteristics, there is no denying that they are black, because when they walk into the room, they are black, and they have been black since they were born, and they will be black until they die. And it's actually, I think, the interesting thing about, and because I have heard that before, it's probably more about the organisations and revealing their discomfort with it than it is about the young people themselves. And that's exactly why that discussion needs to happen, and that's exactly why they called it Black Interns. That's exactly why they need to be in the building. Yeah. I should have said I'm speaking in a personal capacity, so if it's okay, I won't comment on my firm, if that's okay.
And can I add something about 10,000 Black Interns? Because I know you talk about Dawood, who I also know in the book. For me, 10,000 Black Interns, people complain about the pipeline of black talent. And it's a way of saying there's loads of black talent. I mean, these people are extraordinarily successful in the companies that they go into. So I think if there's people here who have internships to place, it really is something to look at. There is a pipeline. These people are talented. Yeah,
and I think they look, Dawood and Michael and Jonathan, who set up 10,000 Black Interns, then what they didn't state is that this is the answer. So if you ever hear David, who was an amazing speaker, and to won't mind me giving him a plug, he coined this term kinks in the hose pipe, which is that if you want the talent to flow, you need to unkink all the different parts of the hose pipe. That is one kink, and it's a really, really important one. I have met people who've said, I'm in this industry because of that initiative, and it has changed their lives. So, like, what's not to like?
Yeah. There's no excuses. Here are talented people. The gentleman over here.
Yes, I have a number of issues which you mentioned earlier with respect to the question of tragedy and solutions. In your experience, in terms of vested interests, adversity, and expectations, what do you think would be the solution? Would it be a government and policy mentioned? In terms of inclusion and initiatives, there are a large number of barriers to progress. Which, in your experience, is the way forward?
Thank you for the question. I know Grace did ask me on the policy front, and I probably didn't do it justice, and it's probably why you've asked me again. So, I think like the first thing we need to do is like measure. I'm going to kind of repeat what I've said in the book, but like we don't measure the risk or opportunity that disadvantaged groups, so just take black people, black communities, we don't measure the impacts of their disadvantage on society. So we measure every risk, and the government, the Bank of England, government, like, they will measure every risk. They'll measure like the risk of raising interest rates, which is obviously very, very pertinent now. They'll measure the risk of inflation, again, very pertinent now. Geopolitical risk, given the tense geopolitical situation, rising or declining longevity, post-COVID. So, like, every risk is measured. And because risk is measured, we understand the impact of it. Once we understand the impact of it, we then understand what we can do about it. So we know that if we let inflation run away, then the cost of living increases. People won't be able to afford to live, so you raise interest rates to dampen demand to control. So there is a cause and there's an effect. But we go straight to the policy decision, but like, what are we going to implement for and to, and how are we going to measure it? Because like, how do you measure the impact of any policy decision that you're making if you don't have a benchmark by which we are working towards? So honestly, before we even get into the policy debate, that would be my first suggestion, would be like inequality needs to be a universal risk that is measured. It impacts everything. So if we just take the examples that I used, like inequality has a significant impact on inflation and the cost of living. Or it causes or prohibits us from reducing the risk of not being sustainable. Like, it's probably the one risk that impacts everything, yet it's not measured. So, like, how do you shape policy if you don't actually have a measure for the outcomes? So that would be my starting point. And I wish I could point to one or two policy initiatives that would resolve this. I really wish I could, and I sat down for 2 years writing that book trying to think of something very tangible, and I just kept coming back to the measure. Like, really.
How do you feel about quotas? So the idea that there's quotas across different levels of organisations by different aspects of diversity.
So I think that I think that it's very, very similar to 10,000 Black Interns. You need to be very, very pointed and targeted about the demographic that you are targeting. The challenge that I think we have with quotas is that this discussion has been going for so long. It's got such a, it creates such a reaction that nobody wants to talk about quotas anymore. But probably more pointedly is that what businesses don't operate on is a quota basis. They normally operate via targets and outcomes. So actually, you could even start with a target. We want to target having X% of our population that might be from an ethnic minority background. But even that, I don't think really is in the language of businesses or even like government. What typically the way that businesses think and also policymakers think is, what is the outcome that we want? We start with the outcome and then think about, well, actually, how do you get there? And what role do those demographics play in achieving that outcome? That is a much more intuitive way of thinking about the problem. So it might be, back to the example that I used about the company, that we need to have, the outcome is that we have data scientists in our organization that are able to contribute to our bottom line. But really the outcome is that actually we need to increase our profit margin by 4% per year, and that pays it. That's the outcome. And that's what dictates, okay, well, to do that, we need to get these people, and actually they'll contribute this. That's what dictates the target, because it's linked to the bottom line. I just think when we tend to do it in isolation, it becomes something which can be hard for businesses and business decisions and policymakers to buy into.
Fantastic. We had a question in the middle. Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. I should have sat at the end. I loved your book, Gavin. It was really beautifully written, so thank you. I wanted to ask a bit more about the business case. So for background, I work in responsible investment at Scottish Widows, and we're always being asked for the business case of, is this ESG fund performing better than the mainstream? And I get really sick of being asked that question. And it's kind of come up again because of all the anti-ESG talk in America. And I feel like it's the same for kind of diversity. Like, if you employ more diverse people, you're not suddenly going to make more money and suddenly be more profitable. It's much more nuanced conversation, and it is good for business. But how do we kind of answer that business case question without having to say, well, okay, it's in the short term, and then, any reflections on that?
Yeah, so I think, so there's a few things here. So again, I think I come back to the McKinsey report, which said that, and forgive me if I've misquoted the numbers, either 32 or 36% and 20 for ethnic minorities and 28% for women, I think it is. But businesses that operate in a healthy profit margin, actually, why do they need, what would compel them to do that if they're already operating at 30% anyway, or even 20%? So, that's the first point. The second point is, as you said, just popping someone on your board isn't going to create instant results. There's a huge amount of pressure and expectation to put on that one individual to change your whole business. So I think the business case needs to be a lot more intuitive and pertinent to each organization. And actually, I don't think there is a blanket business case. So I can give you another example. There was a well-known exclusive club, and they needed to expand overseas. And they looked at their board and their executive and felt that we cannot expand into other regions outside of the UK because we don't understand the culture of, or what's going to appeal. So we need to become more diverse because it will help us achieve our international ambitions. That's their business case. That's very, very different to the online company that was selling goods. What I do think it takes, however, is someone on the inside to have the wherewithal to actually construct that business case for that business. And the key question is, where does that come from? So the ESG debate is interesting to me. The questions around sustainability, you can draw some parallels. So, sustainability, if you think about it, inside organizations, they're now doing something. I think we've gone way beyond it being a choice now. But in the early days, there were people probably who were somewhere higher up in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, even though I know it's outdated, but it's the only one that I've got off the top of my head, who were able to feed themselves, feed their children, and were able to think more about broader societal issues. It was probably more for them about self-actualization. So in that, they would go to the organization or join a cause and say that this issue of sustainability is an existential problem that we need to fix. The challenge that you have with the S and the social challenges are that they're wrapped up in this issue of inequality, and the people that are most impacted by inequality, they're not in those organizations. What they're trying to do is get their kids to school on time, pay their bills, feed themselves, find a job, make ends meet. And they are so far down from self-actualization, they're not actually in the room. So the key question actually is that I think the business case is relatively easy to state. It's just that what is that catalyst within the organization that is going to do it? This topic about inequality is coming onto the agenda. If I look at my own experience, I have experienced it, but I'm now in the room, therefore I'm able to have a voice. But how many other people are?
And we're never asked about the alternative, right? To write the business case for one type of person being in the room, making all the decisions to be creative, which I think is something to think about again. That would be a pretty hard business case to write. Jasmine, I know we're running out of time, so can you give me your best question from online?
What's the one thing that you can advise for young people from minority ethnic backgrounds to do in order to break cycles of generational poverty?
That's an easy one. One thing. Thank you for asking that. But that was my mum, wasn't it?
I hope she's listening, I really do.
I'll get him. So I feel that so I've taken this on, and it has come at, some cost. And Grace, you know what that is like, because you've launched this initiative, you campaign for equality, and it is a calling, but it's also incredibly exhausting. And I know there'll be some people who will disagree with this, and I've had this discussion with them, so if they're listening, I'm sorry, but I have this view that I feel it should just be enough that you can achieve for yourself and for your family and progress. And I feel that should be enough. I know that I have taken this on, and I spend every minute not working or with my family, like talking and thinking or writing about this subject. I feel I have a responsibility too, because there is no one above me, with the exception of someone like maybe Dawid, who is fighting this cause. But it should just be enough for a young black child to do well academically, get a job, progress through the ranks. That should be enough, because if we get enough of those young people coming through, then we'll get representation that will change culture. And that would be the best feedback that I get, or interactions that I have with people, are not, I read your book, it's amazing, or thank you. It is, I applied for that job and I got it, or I've been promoted, or because that's what really, really matters. And that is, honestly, to the person who wrote that, that should be enough. Like, it shouldn't, it is harder, it shouldn't be harder. They are enough, and I think the world just needs to see it.
Fantastic. That's a wonderful moment to end on. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I think Gavin is going to stay around to answer more questions and to sign books. And I do think, I know you're spending a lot of time on this and you are bringing change, but I do think an honorary doctorate is in your future. So that it mightn't be a reward that you want, but I do think it will come to you. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Gavin for a fantastic talk. Can you save them so I can send them to Gavin later? Thank you.